In the final months of World War II, American troops discovered strange posters in a liberated French town. Proof, it seemed, of crimes they never committed. The images looked official, the details chillingly precise. But if none of it was true, who wanted the world to believe it was? December 1944, Alsace, France. The war in Europe was entering its most uncertain phase. Snow blanketed the ruined villages of the Rhine Valley, and the sound of distant artillery echoed through the hills. The men of the U.S. 79th Infantry Division had been pushing east for weeks, reclaiming small towns left hollow by retreating German forces. What they didn't know was that in one of those towns, a new kind of weapon had already been deployed, one that didn't explode but infected minds. It began when a small reconnaissance patrol led by Lieutenant Morris Hayes entered the village of Neuf-Brissac near the Rhine River. The streets were quiet, the air heavy with the smell of smoke and frost. The unit expected landmines, snipers, or hidden traps. What they found instead were papers, hundreds of them plastered on walls, pinned to church doors, and scattered through the mud like confetti after a parade. The posters were printed in French and German, bearing the insignia of the Nazi Ministry of Propaganda. Each showed disturbing illustrations. American soldiers wearing gas masks releasing clouds of vapor over cowering villagers. Beneath the images were bold captions, claiming that American forces had unleashed poison gas attacks on German-occupied towns to drive civilians from their homes. At first glance, it looked absurd, but Lieutenant Hayes wasn't amused. These weren't crude battlefield leaflets or hand-drawn caricatures meant to provoke laughter. The printing was precise. The colors were vivid. The images were detailed, the kind of detail only someone familiar with Allied equipment could know. Each poster even cited specific dates and locations, small Alsatian villages where the U.S. Army had recently fought. The claims were horrifyingly specific. 212 civilians dead near Colmar. American air raid disperses gas on school children. Hayes realized this wasn't propaganda meant for German soldiers. It was meant for French civilians, the very people the Allies had come to liberate. He collected several copies and took them to division headquarters. Intelligence officers examined the posters under lamplight and quickly noticed the signatures, official Nazi stamps, serial numbers, and even forged reproductions of captured Allied documents. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make these forgeries appear genuine. The operation was precise, deliberate, and disturbingly informed. Hayes, who had studied psychology before the war, saw something deeper than lies. This was psychological warfare at a new level, an attempt to weaponize trust itself. In liberated France, rumors spread faster than orders. Villagers already traumatized by years of occupation were vulnerable to fear and suspicion. If they believed the Americans had used banned weapons, cooperation could collapse overnight. The posters struck directly at that fragile alliance between liberators and liberated. Hayes reported his findings to Allied command in Strasbourg, warning that the enemy wasn't just fighting on the battlefield anymore, they were fighting in the minds of the people. That night, he walked through the ruined streets again, looking at the torn posters flapping in the winter wind. The village was silent, but their presence felt louder than any explosion. The images stayed with him. American faces twisted into villains, children running from invisible clouds. He couldn't shake the thought that somewhere, someone in Berlin had planned this, studied Allied values, predicted their reactions, and crafted this deception to perfection. Back at command, Hayes's report reached the intelligence section of the 7th Army. Analysts compared it with other field reports from Belgium and Lorraine. Similar materials had been found. Same designs, same claims, even identical typeface. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't the work of scattered retreating units, but a coordinated propaganda campaign operating across multiple fronts. Yet the question remained, why chemical weapons? Why target the one subject that terrified the world more than anything else? The answer, as Hayes suspected, lay in history. After World War I, when mustard gas and chlorine had scarred an entire generation, the United States became one of the strongest voices against chemical warfare. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 banned such weapons, and America's moral stance on the issue was well known. To accuse Americans of using gas wasn't just to lie, it was to shatter their reputation, to turn their greatest virtue into a weapon against them. As word spread through Allied ranks, a strange unease began to grow. Reports from newly liberated French towns described villagers avoiding American patrols, refusing medical treatment, even hiding their children when soldiers approached. The posters had done their work. A rumor had become a seed of doubt. For Lieutenant Hayes, the discovery marked the beginning of a new kind of battle, one that couldn't be fought with rifles or artillery. It was a war of perception, where truth itself was under attack. And in that quiet village on the edge of the Rhine, he realized something chilling. The Nazis had found a way to strike at the heart of American ideals without ever firing a shot. Within days of Lieutenant Hayes's report, similar discoveries began surfacing across Western Europe. In Belgium, Luxembourg, and even the Netherlands, Allied intelligence units reported the same disturbing phenomenon. Posters, pamphlets, and flyers appearing overnight in villages recently liberated by American forces. Each bore the same official insignias, the same unnerving illustrations of American troops spreading invisible clouds across defenseless civilians. The language changed, but the message was identical. The Americans had used poison gas. At first, some commanders dismissed it as desperate German propaganda, the dying echo of a collapsing regime. But the pattern soon grew impossible to ignore. The materials appeared in towns hundreds of miles apart, printed on the same grade of paper, with identical layout grids and typeface choices. Allied analysts at SHAEF headquarters in Paris began connecting the dots. This wasn't the scattered noise of retreating propagandists. It was a synchronized operation. Someone inside the Nazi apparatus was coordinating a continental-scale disinformation campaign, executed with precision and alarming reach. Major Rachel Hoffman, a specialist in psychological warfare attached to the SHAEF propaganda analysis section, was among the first to see the deeper implications. She had studied propaganda methods used in occupied Europe, the leaflets, broadcasts, and manipulated radio reports, but this was different. The detail in these new materials was unnerving. The forged images showed American M4 Sherman tanks modified with fictional gas projectors, complete with serial markings accurate down to their unit numbers. The alleged eyewitness statements were written in local dialects and referenced real battles the Allies had fought only weeks earlier. Whoever created these lies had access to Allied unit movements, logistics data, even troop insignias. It wasn't random fabrication, it was informed deception. When Major Hoffman presented her initial findings to the Senior Intelligence Board in Paris, she described the campaign as surgical psychological warfare. The goal wasn't to persuade everyone that the Americans were using gas, but to introduce hesitation, to erode certainty among civilians who had just begun to trust their liberators. Once trust fractured, even slightly, every humanitarian act could be questioned. A simple vaccination clinic could become a suspected cover for chemical testing. Every American food delivery could be viewed with suspicion. In a war fought as much for hearts and minds as for territory, such doubt was lethal. As reports mounted, Allied intelligence began tracing the campaign's spread. In the Belgian Ardennes, posters appeared in the days following the Battle of St. Vith. In Luxembourg, pamphlets surfaced near towns where U.S. engineers had set up decontamination stations, facilities meant for cleaning vehicles, not people. In France, forgeries of American Red Cross medical records were discovered, edited to suggest experiments on civilians. The timing and coordination revealed chilling precision. Each release coincided with periods of heavy combat or retreat, designed to sow maximum confusion. By late January 1945, the intelligence summaries presented to General Eisenhower described the campaign as psychological sabotage. The term fit. It wasn't just the falsehood itself that mattered, it was how and when it was delivered. Civilians who once cheered for the arrival of Allied convoys now whispered behind closed doors. Resistance networks that depended on local cooperation began encountering silence. Even a small delay in communication or supply could translate to lives lost at the front. Major Hoffman's team began analyzing the posters under magnification. What they discovered added another layer of mystery. The printing techniques used weren't common in field presses or mobile propaganda units. These materials were produced using advanced color lithography available only in major metropolitan facilities, Berlin, Munich, or perhaps Prague. And yet, some posters carried regional distribution codes normally used by Nazi occupation offices. This meant the operation had both central coordination and local distribution, suggesting a propaganda network that survived the retreat of German forces intact. For the Allies, the implications were alarming. Someone within the Nazi system had planned this long before the tide of war turned. It was not the desperate act of a crumbling power, but the execution of a psychological plan built months, perhaps years, in advance. The deeper analysts dug, the more they began to suspect that the operation's designers had studied not just Allied military habits, but American moral identity itself. American soldiers were taught that they represented justice, liberation, and decency. Their rules of engagement reflected restraint. By accusing them of the very atrocities they abhorred, the Nazi propagandists were attempting something far more insidious than a lie. They were trying to make the truth itself look corrupt. In February, intercepted German radio transmissions provided the first direct clue. Allied signal units picked up encrypted messages referencing an operation called Weisshauch, white breath. The codename, later confirmed through captured documents, referred to the spreading of moral fog among enemy-occupied populations. Its objective was clear: undermine Allied moral credibility through falsified evidence of war crimes. By the time this information reached Paris, the damage had already begun. Reports from French prefects described unrest among villagers, arguments breaking out in marketplaces, and even protests near supply stations. A single image printed on a wall had turned neighbor against neighbor, liberator against liberated. Major Hoffman stood over her desk late one evening, studying the collage of samples pinned to the wall. Dozens of posters from across the front, each more convincing than the last. What frightened her most wasn't the artistry or even the lies themselves. It was how effective they were. For the first time in the war, the Allies weren't fighting for ground. They were fighting for perception. And in that shadow battlefield, victory would depend not on firepower, but on truth itself. A truth suddenly harder to recognize amid the fog of propaganda. The investigation soon reached the heart of Berlin, the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, an institution that had turned deception into an art form. At its center stood Joseph Goebbels, the mastermind who once described propaganda as a weapon sharper than any sword. But within his sprawling ministry, a lesser-known department had emerged with a different purpose: not to glorify the Reich, but to distort the enemy's soul. Its name was Amt Concordia, a secretive division created under Goebbels' direct orders during the later stages of the war. Amt Concordia operated in the shadows, buried deep inside the ministry's administrative maze. Its existence barely appeared in official documents, hidden among projects labeled as defensive psychological operations. While other departments managed newspapers, cinema, and radio broadcasts, Concordia specialized in what it called mirror warfare, reflecting the enemy's image back upon itself until even the truth appeared foreign. The man directing this operation was Werner Naumann, a senior propagandist known for his methodical brilliance. Before joining the ministry, Naumann had studied American journalism and public opinion research, fascinated by how democratic societies shaped belief through information. He understood that America's power wasn't only industrial or military, it was moral. The United States had built its wartime identity on principles, fairness, decency, and a refusal to descend into the barbarism of totalitarianism. Naumann saw in that ideal a vulnerability. Records later recovered from his department revealed chilling precision in his thought process. He wrote, "The Americans must not be hated, they must be doubted. Hatred unites, doubt fractures." That single line captured the philosophy behind the chemical weapons propaganda. Naumann and his team knew that the world remembered the horrors of mustard gas from the First World War, the blinding vapors, the scarred soldiers, the fields turned to wastelands. They also knew that after those horrors, the United States had been one of the strongest voices in the Geneva Convention's campaign to outlaw chemical warfare. For Naumann, that commitment wasn't a strength, it was an opening. His team studied Allied archives, intercepted radio transmissions, and even captured American field manuals to craft their deception with surgical accuracy. They collected photographs of real American equipment and modified them using studio techniques that rivaled the film industry's best. They forged documents citing false testing sites and used actual maps to pinpoint their fabricated attacks. Each poster, each pamphlet, each broadcast was designed to strike not at soldiers' bodies, but at their conscience. Inside Amt Concordia's offices, teams of linguists, artists, and social psychologists worked side by side. They analyzed the emotional patterns of occupied populations, predicting how fear would spread, which rumors would take root, and how long it would take for a lie to turn into collective memory. Their guiding principle was simplicity, a falsehood repeated in the right tone, at the right moment, could survive any truth that came after. Naumann's reports to Goebbels outlined the propaganda in 3 phases. First, implantation, seed the claim of chemical attacks through printed material and whispered rumors. Second, validation, reinforce those claims through fake survivor testimonies and local gossip networks. Third, institutionalization, ensure that even when proven false, the lie lived on through suspicion. People may stop believing the story, one memo read, but they will never forget the doubt. Goebbels approved the plan immediately. By late 1944, as the Allies closed in on German territory, the Nazi propaganda machine shifted into overdrive. Shortwave radio broadcasts began describing American atrocities in Alsace and toxic clouds over Belgium. Local collaborators spread leaflets through rural regions at night. Every detail was engineered to look authentic, from the fonts to the military markings. When Allied psychological warfare units first examined the materials, many couldn't tell the difference between real and forged. In the midst of Germany's military collapse, Amt Concordia thrived. The chaos of retreat gave its operations freedom. Communication lines were already fragmented. Few questioned where resources were being sent. As factories burned, Naumann's printing presses kept running. To him, propaganda wasn't a desperate act, it was Germany's final strategic weapon. The Reich might lose the land war, but if it could corrode Allied legitimacy in the eyes of the world, history itself could be rewritten. Allied intelligence, unaware of Naumann's identity at the time, began noticing patterns that hinted at an organized mastermind. The consistency of the typography, the rhythm of release, the thematic precision, all pointed to central coordination. Some analysts believed it was Goebbels himself, but the level of psychological targeting suggested someone operating with more subtlety. Only after the war would investigators learn that Naumann's department had drawn heavily from psychological warfare theories published in the United States before the conflict. Studies about morale, persuasion, and media influence that had been meant for civilian use. He had simply inverted them. The campaign's genius was its restraint. It didn't need to convince the entire population that the Americans had used chemical weapons. It only needed to inject uncertainty, to fracture unity at the precise moment the Allies depended most on local support. Every hour lost to hesitation, every supply route disrupted by fear, every handshake avoided by suspicion, all of it served the Reich's dying cause. By the end of 1944, the propaganda web Naumann had spun stretched from the Ardennes to Alsace. It was no longer just a lie, it was a contagion of doubt spreading invisibly through liberated Europe. And as Major Hoffman studied its reach from her desk in Paris, she began to grasp what she was truly facing, not a mere propaganda effort, but a psychological campaign designed to turn morality itself into a weapon. By early 1945, the Nazi propaganda machine had achieved something no army could, creating invisible front lines inside the hearts of liberated towns. The battlefield of truth stretched across every conversation, every hesitant glance, every uncertain handshake between American soldiers and the civilians they came to free. In the Belgian town of Malmedy, the consequences became tragically clear. Weeks after the Germans were driven out, American civil affairs units arrived to restore order, distribute food, and help rebuild shattered lives. Among them was Captain Vincent Shaw, a measured and thoughtful officer who had spent much of the war working with local populations. He had helped reopen schools in Normandy and rebuild hospitals in northern France. Malmedy, he believed, would be another town ready to heal, but instead of gratitude, he found silence. When his convoy rolled into the town square, people turned away. Shopkeepers shuttered their doors. Mothers pulled children inside. The townspeople had heard the rumors, the same false stories planted by the propaganda posters. Whispers spread that American medics had tested gas masks on prisoners, that captured Germans were buried in contaminated trenches, that American rations were tainted. The lies had taken root, and now no amount of good intention could erase the shadow they cast. Shaw tried to bridge the divide through action. He arranged food deliveries, supervised medical clinics, and invited local clergy to inspect supply stores. But suspicion lingered. One elderly man refused to accept a blanket stamped with the U.S. Army insignia, saying he wouldn't, quote, touch poison-marked cloth. When a group of American engineers offered to repair a damaged well, villagers refused to drink from it afterward, convinced the soldiers had poisoned the water. Within days, the mission to rebuild Malmedy began to collapse under the weight of rumor. The civil affairs team's morale crumbled. Soldiers who had risked their lives to liberate the town now faced distrust from the people they considered friends. To them, this was more than misunderstanding. It was betrayal. They had come to fight tyranny, and now they stood accused of spreading terror. The situation in Malmedy was not isolated. Similar stories emerged from Hue, Eupen, and other towns across Belgium and Luxembourg. The propaganda had created a psychological fog that even victory couldn't clear. American commanders received conflicting reports, some locals cooperating, others retreating into silence. Civilians refused American medical treatment, claiming they feared chemical infection. Resistance groups went underground again, worried that their ties to Allied forces might make them targets of a new, invisible weapon. Captain Shaw recorded his experiences in a brief report later archived at SHAEF headquarters. His words captured the emotional toll better than any analysis. "We are being looked at," he wrote,
not as men who liberated them, but as something uncertain, something to be watched. You can feel it in the streets, in their eyes. The posters did what bullets never could. Back in Paris, Major Rachel Hoffman read Shaw's report with growing unease. It confirmed her worst fear, that the Nazi propaganda campaign wasn't designed merely to slander. It was designed to isolate. The purpose was to sever the human connection between liberator and liberated, between truth and trust. If civilians could no longer believe in the Americans, then Reconstruction itself, the very proof of Allied progress, would falter. The campaign also inflicted deep psychological wounds within the American ranks. Soldiers who had endured combat now faced a subtler, more painful challenge. They could fight an enemy they could see, but not one hidden behind the faces of frightened civilians. Many began questioning their own efforts. Letters home from the front described confusion and despair. Why were they being doubted? Why were they hated for crimes they never committed?
For younger troops, the accusations struck at their very sense of identity. They had grown up hearing that America fought for justice and decency. To be accused of atrocities they never imagined shattered that belief. Veterans of earlier campaigns who had earned the trust of liberated communities in Normandy found themselves suddenly viewed as pariahs. The propaganda had turned honor into something fragile. At headquarters, senior officers debated how to respond. Some proposed issuing official denials, but Hoffman cautioned against it. A denial amplifies a lie, she warned. The more you argue against it, the more it sounds true. Her suggestion was to counter with proof, not words. Documented evidence, verified by neutral observers. But evidence took time, and time was what the Nazis had weaponized. Every hour the truth lagged behind the rumor, another village turned cold. By February, the psychological fallout reached even the home front. Allied correspondents covering the war began hearing fragments of the false story, carried by refugees and reprinted in small European papers. The myth of American gas attacks briefly appeared in underground German broadcasts, claiming the United States had violated international law. Though most listeners dismissed it, the seed of doubt had already crossed borders. In the villages of Belgium and France, the damage could not be measured in casualties or destroyed property. It lived in silence, in empty streets when convoys passed, in children who no longer waved, in doors that stayed closed when soldiers knocked. For many Americans, it was the first time they experienced how a lie could wound as deeply as any weapon. Captain Shaw stayed in Malmedy through winter, refusing to leave until trust was restored. Slowly, through relentless effort, some villagers began to soften. When an outbreak of illness struck in March, American medics provided treatment, and their care began to dispel fear. Yet the recovery was fragile, built on fragile gestures rather than words. In his final report before redeployment, Shaw wrote one last line that echoed through Allied archives. We won the town back not through power, but patience. The propaganda lost only when we kept showing them who we really were. For those who lived it, the campaign left marks that never faded. The psychological scars lingered long after the posters had crumbled from the walls. In the quiet towns of Belgium, the war's most dangerous weapon had never been fired. It had been believed. By the spring of 1945, the lie had traveled farther than any army. Across liberated Europe, it moved quietly, from whispers in cafes to rumors in church pews, from broken radios to the uncertain pages of underground newspapers. The claim that American forces had used poison gas was no longer a single falsehood. It had become a network of belief, and to defeat it, words alone would never be enough. At Supreme Headquarters in Paris, Allied Command convened an emergency session. Reports from civil affairs divisions and intelligence units painted a clear picture. The Nazi disinformation campaign was undermining Reconstruction. fracturing civilian cooperation and even threatening diplomatic relations with neutral nations. General Eisenhower's staff authorized a new operation, unlike anything attempted before. Its code name, Operation Clean Slate. Major Rachel Hoffman, whose early analysis had exposed the pattern behind the posters, was appointed to lead it. Her mission was simple to describe, but nearly impossible to achieve: prove that something never happened. To clear the American name, she and her multinational team had to dismantle an illusion woven across half a continent. The first step was evidence. Hoffman's analysts began compiling a complete inventory of American chemical weapons policies. They gathered documents from the War Department in Washington, storage records from depots in England, and shipping manifests from supply vessels that had crossed the Atlantic. Each report confirmed the same fact: chemical weapons had remained locked away, unused. Yet facts on paper meant little to civilians who had seen the Nazi posters. Proof had to be visible. To counter the propaganda's emotional power, Hoffman needed credibility rooted in local trust. She reached out to respected community figures, priests, doctors, teachers, and mayors from liberated towns, and invited them to witness investigations at the supposed attack sites. When the team arrived in Alsace, they brought not soldiers, but scientists. American chemists, French physicians, and British medical officers examined the soil, the wells, and the buildings named in the Nazi claims. Their conclusion was unanimous: no trace of chemical agents, no evidence of contamination, and no injuries consistent with exposure. In one of the first counter-reports, signed jointly by French and American experts, the statement read, "No physical or medical indication supports claims of chemical warfare in this region." It was clinical, but it carried moral weight. The document was distributed through Allied information channels, reprinted in newspapers, and broadcast through local radio stations. Civilians began to listen. But Operation Clean Slate didn't stop there. The team needed to expose the machinery behind the lie itself. Hoffman's British counterparts in the Psychological Warfare Division traced the posters' design patterns and discovered identical templates used in earlier Nazi campaigns. The fonts, layout grids, and photo compositions matched files found in captured German archives from Paris and Munich. The breakthrough came when Allied troops overran a small printing facility near Speyer, just west of the Rhine. Inside, they found intact lithographic plates, precise reproductions of the same propaganda posters that had appeared across France and Belgium. Some still bore drying ink. Forensic experts examined the plates and matched the serial numbers to supply shipments from Berlin's propaganda ministry. Among the debris were design sketches, marked with coded references to Concordia Phase 2. It was the first physical evidence linking the fake gas attack campaign to Werner Naumann's secret unit. Hoffman finally had what she needed: a tangible trail connecting the propaganda to its source. Using the captured materials, her team reconstructed the entire process: the forgeries, the printing methods, the regional distribution maps. It became clear that Amt Concordia had pre-positioned propaganda caches long before the Allied advance, ensuring the posters could appear instantly in newly liberated towns. Their precision wasn't coincidence, it was planning. Meanwhile, Hoffman's public outreach team built a counter-narrative that mirrored the enemy's sophistication. They didn't deny the accusations outright. Instead, they documented the investigation's progress step by step, turning transparency into a weapon. Newsreels showed local villagers walking the supposed gas zones with Allied doctors. French newspapers published photographs of empty canisters labeled fraudulent Nazi forgeries. Even neutral Swiss correspondents were invited to inspect captured printing presses. The approach worked because it restored agency to the people most affected, allowing them to see, touch, and decide for themselves. As evidence spread, the lie began to unravel. In some towns, priests who had once warned their congregations about toxic Americans, now used sermons to publicly renounce the rumor. Belgian resistance leaders issued statements praising Allied humanitarian work. The transformation was slow, fragile, and never complete, but it was enough to start reversing the tide. Still, Operation Clean Slate faced internal challenges. Some American officers questioned whether the mission was worth the effort. "Why chase ghosts when the war's almost over?" one colonel asked. "Because the ghosts will outlive the war if we don't." Hoffman's answer was recorded in a field memo later cited in post-war psychological warfare studies. Her prediction was right. Even as Allied armies crossed the Rhine, remnants of the propaganda persisted. Refugees repeated fragments of the lie to Red Cross officials. Captured German soldiers swore they had heard of chemical attacks. The falsehood refused to die easily. It had burrowed into the war's collective memory. Then, in late March 1945, a discovery confirmed the full scale of the deception. American troops advancing toward the Ruhr captured a freight train loaded with crates marked educational materials. Inside were tens of thousands of freshly printed posters, identical to those found months earlier. The crates were bound for regions not yet liberated. The operation had been preparing to expand even as the Reich collapsed. The captured stockpile became Hoffman's most powerful tool. She organized exhibitions in major European cities, displaying the confiscated propaganda alongside verified evidence disproving it. Audiences could see the lie and the truth side by side. For many Europeans, it was the first time they understood how deliberate and calculated the Nazi disinformation effort had been. Operation Clean Slate concluded officially in April 1945. By then, the Nazi propaganda network had been exposed, its forgeries publicly discredited, and its logistical infrastructure dismantled. Yet Hoffman's final report struck a somber tone. "Disinformation leaves residue," she wrote. "Even when defeated, it stains belief." She was right. The Nazi posters were gone, but their shadow lingered in memories and rumors. Still, for the first time since Lieutenant Hayes had discovered those papers in Alsace, the Americans had reclaimed more than their reputation. They had reclaimed the truth itself. And in a war built on competing versions of reality, that victory was as vital as any won on the battlefield. When Allied forces swept into Germany in the spring of 1945, they expected to find chaos. What they didn't expect was an archive of deception more elaborate than any battlefield map. Hidden inside abandoned government buildings, among stacks of fading documents and propaganda leaflets, they began to uncover the machinery of a campaign that had nearly reshaped the war's psychological front. In late April, intelligence officers following leads from Operation Clean Slate entered a compound on the outskirts of Potsdam, just west of Berlin. It had once served as a communications training center. What they found there shocked even the most seasoned analysts. Behind reinforced doors lay a room filled with filing cabinets, metal reels, and stacks of coded reports stamped with the insignia of the Amt Concordia. The secret department that Major Hoffman had spent months trying to trace was suddenly real, tangible, and intact. The documents told a story as precise as it was disturbing. Meticulous field assessments charted the effectiveness of the propaganda in every region it reached. There were maps color-coded to show where rumors had taken hold most strongly: green for disbelief, yellow for uncertainty, red for full acceptance. The data revealed something chilling. In certain areas of Belgium and Alsace, the Nazi chemical weapons lie had been believed by over half the local population at its peak. Each report bore Werner Naumann's signature. The files detailed not only the spread of the campaign, but its planned evolution. The next phase, labeled Operation Echo, aimed to fabricate photographs and survivor accounts of chemical attacks, using studio sets and actors drawn from concentration camps. The materials included detailed scripts for fake interviews, lists of stage props, and photographic negatives showing mock attack scenes. The goal was to create an enduring historical record, a lie so complete that it would survive even after Germany's defeat. Inside another folder, Allied analysts found correspondence between Naumann and Joseph Goebbels himself. The letters showed the Nazi leadership understood they were violating international law. One memo, written in Goebbels' distinctive style, read, "Truth has no place in survival. The enemy's morality is his weakness." The admission was as shocking as the act itself. The deception had never been about misinformation. It was about corruption, the deliberate poisoning of truth. Among the files was evidence of how precisely the campaign had been measured. Concordia's analysts monitored civilian morale reports gathered from occupied territories and even intercepted Allied broadcasts. They had calculated how long each rumor lasted, how far it traveled, and how often it resurfaced. To them, propaganda was not just an art, it was a science of control. The Potsdam discovery sparked a series of raids across Berlin and its surrounding towns. In one bomb-damaged villa in Charlottenburg, Allied investigators found a half-burned diary believed to belong to a Concordia artist. The entries described his work creating fake American insignias and retouching photographs. One haunting line read, "We are painting ghosts, the kind that look alive enough to be believed." Back in Paris, when the captured files reached Major Hoffman's desk, she spent nights reviewing the contents. Every forged signature, every fabricated testimony, every staged photo represented a layer of the lie that had nearly turned victory into suspicion. But among the evidence, she noticed something else, signs of desperation. As the war turned against them, Concordia's tone shifted from confidence to panic. Reports grew shorter, less methodical. Budgets shrank. Requests for materials were denied. By March 1945, Naumann's last memo pleaded for additional paper stock to continue morale defense operations. The empire of illusion was collapsing under its own weight. When Berlin finally fell, Allied investigators reached what remained of the propaganda ministry. Amid the ruins, they recovered a final cache of Concordia files, blueprints for false archives that had never been completed. The Nazis had planned to deposit fake documents in libraries, churches, and universities across Europe to ensure the propaganda lived on in historical records. Their defeat had come just in time. The captured evidence revealed the full extent of how close the truth had come to vanishing beneath layers of fabrication. For Allied intelligence, it was both a triumph and a warning. They had dismantled the most sophisticated disinformation network of the war, but in doing so, they realized something unsettling. Lies, once set loose, had no borders. Even in ruins, Concordia's design lived on, teaching a dangerous lesson that perception could be engineered more efficiently than bullets could be fired. The Americans sealed the archives and transported them under guard to Paris for cataloging. What began as a handful of mysterious posters in a French village had led to the unmasking of an entire psychological weapons program. The deception had been vast, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. And though the campaign itself had been crushed, its lingering effects, mistrust, doubt, and fractured memory remained long after the last Concordia office went dark. When the Allied investigators pieced together the recovered documents from Amt Concordia, they realized they hadn't just uncovered a single campaign. They had exposed a new frontier of warfare. The Nazi chemical weapons propaganda wasn't an isolated deception. It represented a shift in how conflicts would be fought from that point forward. It was no longer enough to destroy an enemy's armies or cities. The real victory lay in destroying certainty itself. Throughout World War II, every major power had engaged in propaganda. Britain had dropped morale-boosting leaflets over occupied France. The United States had broadcast radio programs encouraging resistance and hope. Even the Soviets had flooded Europe with promises of liberation, but what the Nazis attempted through the chemical attack hoax was fundamentally different. It wasn't an exaggeration of events, it was the creation of a reality that never existed, a complete inversion of truth. Historians later called it the first deliberate attempt at synthetic atrocity propaganda. Traditional wartime messaging tried to inspire loyalty or hatred. Amped Concordia's operation sought to make people question the very possibility of truth. Its genius was in the precision of its moral target. By choosing chemical weapons, a subject deeply tied to human horror and collective memory, the Nazis struck at something sacred in the American conscience. They turned virtue into vulnerability. For the Americans, this realization was deeply unsettling. The captured Concordia manuals revealed how carefully the propagandists had studied American culture. They analyzed Hollywood films, newspaper headlines, and presidential speeches to learn what ideals the public cherished most. Freedom, justice, decency, fairness. These were not just values to admire, but pressure points to exploit. The campaign demonstrated that the more strongly a nation believed in its moral identity, the more fragile it could become under psychological attack. At Allied headquarters, analysts began comparing Concordia's operation with other propaganda efforts uncovered during the war. One file referenced Operation Grafe, Otto Skorzeny's mission during the Battle of the Bulge, where German commandos disguised themselves in American uniforms to create chaos behind Allied lines. The deception there was physical, uniforms and vehicles, but the principle was the same, weaponizing familiarity, turning the recognizable into the enemy. Concordia had taken that concept from the battlefield to the mind. Another comparison emerged with the infamous Radio Calais broadcasts, where German announcers pretended to be British soldiers reporting from the front, subtly inserting defeatist rumors among true updates. Yet even those efforts paled in comparison to the scale and sophistication of the fake gas attack campaign. What made Concordia's work unique was its scientific precision, its understanding that a well-crafted lie didn't have to last forever. It only had to survive long enough to change behavior, delay trust, and alter the rhythm of resistance. The captured files soon made their way to London and Washington, where intelligence agencies pored over every page. Military historians and analysts recognized the documents for what they were, the blueprint for a new kind of conflict. The British Political Warfare Executive noted in its report that the methods used in the Concordia deception anticipate future forms of international propaganda, where facts will be engineered rather than found. In academic circles, scholars debated whether the campaign marked the birth of information warfare. It was a phrase not yet common in 1945, but its meaning was clear. Wars of the future would not rely solely on armies, but on perception, on manipulating how nations and peoples understood the world around them. The idea that truth could be designed rather than discovered would haunt the post-war decades. For Major Hoffman, reviewing those files in Paris, the implications were personal. She had seen the damage such deception could cause, the hesitation in a villager's eyes, the silence between allies, the doubt that no document could erase. To her, the Concordia operation was not just an artifact of Nazi fanaticism, it was a warning of how fragile democracy could become if it failed to protect the truth. She wrote in her final intelligence summary, "The enemy has taught us that belief itself can be occupied territory." As Europe rebuilt and governments drafted new conventions on warfare, the lessons of the propaganda war lingered quietly in the background. The Geneva Treaties had outlawed chemical weapons after World War I. Now, policymakers debated whether new laws were needed to address the manipulation of information. How do you regulate a weapon that leaves no crater, no smoke, and yet reshapes entire populations? The Nazi disinformation campaign of 1944-45 was ultimately a failure in military terms. It did not reverse Germany's defeat, but in another sense, it succeeded beyond its creator's intent. It had shown the world that perception could be engineered with the same precision as a bomb. And though the Allies had triumphed in Europe, they emerged from the conflict aware that the next great struggle would not begin with tanks crossing borders. It would begin with lies crossing minds. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Europe erupted in celebration. But beneath the parades and victory flags, quieter scars remained, ones no victory speech could erase. The Nazi propaganda campaign, though dismantled, had left behind something insidious, lingering suspicion, memory shaped by deceit, and a faint but stubborn question that refused to die. In ports of Belgium and eastern France, the rumor of American gas attacks didn't vanish with Germany's surrender. It softened, distorted, and survived in whispers. Some villagers remembered the lies as truth, others as uncertainty. Oral historians decades later would find traces of it in recorded interviews. Stories of strange clouds over fields, of sick animals, of a night when someone swore they smelled chemicals. None of it had happened, yet pieces of the fiction had fused with lived memory. For the Americans who had fought there, the consequences were more personal. The soldiers who had walked through those suspicious towns carried home a burden that followed them far beyond the battlefield. They had faced not only the enemy's fire, but the weight of false accusation. Many never spoke about it, unsure how to explain the feeling of being distrusted by the people they had risked their lives to save.
Captain Vincent Shaw returned to his hometown in Ohio in the summer of 1946. The war was over, but his letters home told of something unresolved. "It's strange," he wrote to a fellow officer, "how a lie can still feel heavier than the war itself." Like many veterans, he found that the victory felt incomplete, not because of what they had failed to achieve, but because of what had been taken from them, the unquestioned belief that they had been seen as heroes. Major Rachel Hoffman continued her work for the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division after the war, contributing to reports on propaganda's long-term effects. Her post-war papers contained a recurring warning: truth is slower than rumor. It limps while lies run. She had seen firsthand how information, once poisoned, rarely recovered its purity. The lie had done exactly what its creators intended. It had fractured trust, even if only for a moment, and that moment had been enough to wound deeply. In post-war Europe, the emotional debris of the campaign outlasted the ruins. Civilians who had once feared American troops later tried to make amends, but even reconciliation carried discomfort. Memory is fragile, and guilt is stubborn. For some, admitting they had believed the Nazi posters felt like betraying the liberators all over again. So the subject faded into silence, folded into the background of local history where no one wanted to reopen it. Historians studying the era decades later found that the chemical gas rumor appeared sporadically in regional archives. Brief mentions in old newspapers, letters, or oral traditions, often without context. The story had survived the war not as propaganda, but as myth. And myths, unlike armies, never truly surrender. The soldiers who lived through it grew old, their medals gathering dust, their memories dimming. But for some, the wound never fully closed. They had seen the power of deception to distort not only public opinion, but personal identity. They had watched honor become questioned and truth treated as optional. In the quiet years after the war, that knowledge became its own kind of scar, one that could not be displayed or explained, only endured. For those who understood what had happened, the greatest tragedy of the propaganda war wasn't the lie itself, but how effectively it revealed a timeless truth, that once trust is broken, it can never return exactly as it was. The enemy had been defeated, but the shadow of his deception lingered, in memories, in doubt, and in the uneasy awareness that wars of the mind never end as cleanly as wars of armies. In the months after Germany's surrender,
Allied investigators began the vast and complicated work of collecting evidence for the upcoming war crimes tribunals. The focus was on the obvious atrocities, the concentration camps, forced labor, and mass executions. But buried within the intelligence reports was another kind of crime, harder to define and impossible to photograph. It wasn't committed with bullets or bombs. It was carried out with words, paper, and the deliberate corrosion of truth. Among the captured German officials eventually brought to trial was Werner Naumann, the man who had led Amt Concordia. He had escaped Berlin in the final days of April 1945, slipping through the chaos with false papers identifying him as a civilian translator. For years, he lived under a false name in northern Germany, blending quietly into the ruins of a defeated nation. It wasn't until the early 1950s that British intelligence agents finally located and arrested him, acting on information supplied by a former propaganda colleague seeking leniency. When Naumann was interrogated, he showed no remorse. In recorded testimony later declassified by Allied archives, he defended his actions with chilling calm. "Propaganda is a weapon," he said. "We did not violate morality, we used it." To Naumann, there was no moral boundary between deception and destruction. He insisted that his campaign against the Americans had been a legitimate tool of war. He called it psychological defense, arguing that if the Allies had bombed German cities, then Germany had the right to attack Allied morale. His words left investigators uneasy. Unlike the physical crimes of war, this kind of deception left no tangible victims, no mass graves, no destroyed towns, only suspicion and doubt. How could they measure harm that was invisible but lasting? Some prosecutors argued that Naumann's work had directly endangered civilians and Allied personnel by inciting hostility and undermining humanitarian operations. Others hesitated. The international laws written before the war had not anticipated this kind of weapon. Propaganda wasn't listed in the Geneva Conventions. It existed in a moral gray zone, recognized as dangerous, but legally undefined. At the Nuremberg trials, the propaganda apparatus as a whole did face scrutiny. Joseph Goebbels had taken his own life before capture, but several of his deputies were questioned about Concordia's activities. Many claimed ignorance, describing the fake chemical weapons campaign as routine morale operations. When the tribunal sought to categorize the crime, it struggled for language. It was not genocide, nor a conventional war crime. The most it could be labeled was criminal deception, a phrase that captured the unease of an era unprepared for psychological warfare. Documents from the trials showed that some Allied legal experts pushed to expand the definition of war crimes to include large-scale disinformation intended to incite violence or disrupt civilian stability. Yet, without precedent, the argument faltered. Naumann and his surviving colleagues were eventually tried in a lesser German court. The verdict reflected the limitations of justice at the time. Convicted of subversive activity against public peace, he served only a few years before release. But Naumann's story didn't end there. After the war, during the early years of the Cold War, intelligence agencies from both East and West took a renewed interest in the captured Concordia archives. The methods Naumann had perfected, the use of truth fragments to construct believable falsehoods, became case studies in new kinds of political influence operations. The files that had once served a collapsing Reich were now studied by nations rebuilding in fear of each other. In Washington, analysts at the newly formed CIA examined the Concordia documents closely. A confidential report from 1948 described the propaganda unit's work as a forerunner to modern information warfare. The report warned that the moral ambiguity surrounding such operations could become a future threat. When truth is treated as flexible, it read, Any democracy that fights a war of ideas risks becoming its own deceiver. Meanwhile, European historians began documenting how deeply the Nazi campaign had infiltrated post-war memory. Some rural communities in France and Belgium, unaware of the propaganda's origins, preserved the false stories in local folklore. Scholars tracing those narratives back to 1944 found how perfectly Naumann's plan had worked. He had created a lie designed to outlive him. For Major Rachel Hoffman, who had returned to the United States after the war, the news of Naumann's light sentence brought no sense of closure. In her private papers, she wrote that justice had failed not because the crime went unpunished, but because the world still struggled to name it. Quote, "He attacked belief," end quote, and there is no courtroom for that. Her words reflected a growing realization among post-war thinkers. The truth, once deliberately poisoned, could not be fully restored by law or punishment. The tribunal could imprison a man, but it could not erase the shadow he left behind. As Europe entered the Cold War, governments began constructing their own propaganda networks, learning from the very playbook they had condemned. Radio broadcasts, forged documents, and psychological operations became routine weapons in the ideological standoff between East and West. The lessons of Amt Concordia had not been buried, they had evolved. The propaganda war that had begun in the alleys of Alsace had ended in a courtroom without a name for its crime. And while justice struggled to define the boundaries of deception, the world quietly prepared for a new kind of conflict, one where truth itself would become the most contested territory of all. Even as the Nazi propaganda campaign collapsed under its own deceit, the Americans faced an internal test unlike any other. Their enemies' lies had questioned not their strength, but their character. In the eyes of millions of civilians across Europe, the integrity of the United States, the nation that had crossed an ocean to liberate strangers, was suddenly uncertain. To restore that trust, the Americans would have to prove their truth not through statements or denials, but through action. The Allied victory in Europe wasn't only measured in territory reclaimed or armies defeated. It was also measured in restraint, in the conscious decision to hold fast to moral principles, even when falsely accused. Throughout the final months of the war, while German propaganda insisted that the United States had unleashed chemical weapons, American field commanders quietly reinforced one unbreakable rule: no use of chemical agents under any circumstance. Even when intelligence reports warned of potential German gas attacks during the Ardennes and the Siegfried Line battles, the order remained firm: prepare for defense, but never initiate. In a war scarred by moral compromise on every front, that consistency became a quiet form of defiance. American commanders understood that their credibility and victory would matter far more than any tactical advantage chemical weapons might provide. "If we abandon who we are to win," one senior officer wrote in his field log, "then we've already lost." Those words, though simple, captured the essence of America's unspoken strategy: winning the war without surrendering the nation's conscience. As the tide turned and Allied forces moved deeper into Germany, American soldiers faced countless opportunities to retaliate, to give in to anger, or to confirm the enemy's narrative through vengeance. But instead, they built clinics in bombed-out villages, treated wounded German civilians, and shared rations with hungry children who had once been taught to fear them. These acts of mercy, repeated thousands of times across ruined landscapes, became the most powerful counter-argument to the Nazi lie. In Alsace, where the propaganda campaign had first taken root, Captain Vincent Shaw returned to the same villages where suspicion had once shadowed every patrol. This time, he came not with weapons, but with engineers and medical teams. Together, they rebuilt the wells the locals had feared were poisoned.
They repaired roofs, reopened schools, and helped farmers restore their fields. Slowly, the silence that had once greeted American convoys began to lift. Children waved again. The mistrust that had once defined the town began to fade, not because of leaflets or speeches, but because of consistency. Every meal shared, every wound treated, and every kind gesture became an act of resistance against the lie. In that quiet restoration of faith, the Americans found a form of victory that no propaganda could distort. The Nazi campaign had sought to corrupt their image. Instead, it had given them the opportunity to define it on their own terms.
Major Rachel Hoffman, observing these efforts from SHAEF headquarters, wrote in her final memorandum, "Truth must live, not be spoken. Every act of decency performed under suspicion carries more power than 1,000 declarations." She understood that the propaganda war had not been won through exposure or legal condemnation alone. It had been won through endurance, through the refusal to compromise principles even when belief itself had been weaponized. Still, the victory came at a cost that would never appear on any battlefield map. For the soldiers who had lived under suspicion, the emotional burden endured long after the fighting ended. Some returned home proud, yet disillusioned, carrying the weight of being doubted. They had seen the fragile nature of truth and how easily it could be reshaped. Many spoke of the experience only in fragments. Stories of villagers who refused help, of newspapers repeating lies, of faces that turned away. The bitterness faded slowly, replaced with something quieter, a sense of purpose drawn from survival without hatred. To those who had been there, the real triumph of the American campaign in Europe wasn't in the surrender signed at Reims or Berlin. It was in the thousands of small acts that restored trust where lies had taken hold. The war had shown that ideals, once tested, could emerge stronger if defended through example rather than force. In the years that followed, the story of the Nazi propaganda war faded into archives, known only to historians and intelligence officers. But its legacy lived on in the unspoken code carried by the men and women who had endured it. The truth, no matter how fragile, could still endure if lived faithfully. For Major Hoffman, who would later serve as an advisor in post-war psychological operations, the campaign offered an enduring lesson. In her final report to the War Department, she wrote, "Victory does not come when lies are silenced, but when truth continues to act despite them." It was a statement born not from theory, but from hard-won experience. By the time American forces left Europe, many of the same villages that had once turned away from them now held memorials in their honor. Their names appeared on plaques, their deeds retold by the children of those who had once doubted them. In those quiet tributes lay the final vindication, not of propaganda refuted, but of humanity restored. The Nazi disinformation campaign had failed in its ultimate aim. It had tried to stain America's image forever, but instead it revealed something enduring, that moral strength, when tested, can become a weapon of its own. It cannot erase loss nor mend every scar, but it can withstand the darkest attempts to twist it. The victory the Americans carried home was not unscarred, not pure, but it was real, earned, and deeply human.